Thank you. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Like she said, I'm Miron Orozco, and today I wanted to talk to you about the female representation in the myth of Europe. So this is the index that we are going to be following today. First off, for everyone that might not know the myth or doesn't quite remember it right now, I'm going to make a brief summary of what the myth is about. Then I will make some notes on what Europe is as a character, or what we are used to see as the representation of Europe. Then I think it's really important to make a couple of notes, very brief notes that I think are going to be key into understanding the examples that we have later. We're going to start with Ovid, and then we are going to move on to the Spanish tradition with Enrique de Villena, Fray Luis de León, and Antonio Gual. And then we will talk about the conclusions that we can draw from all of this. So first off, what is the myth about? The myth basically tells us it's centered in the sexual relationship between the god Jupiter and a woman named Europe. Europe was a princess. She was daughter to the king of Phoenicia. It could be Agenor or Phoenix. It depends on the storyteller. And one day she's with her friends at the beach, and a bull comes up to her, and one way or another she ends up getting on the bull, and the bull takes off and crosses the sea to Crete. And that's where they have sexual intercourse. Whether those were consented or not, it's something that we are going to talk about. And that's basically the myth. Every storyteller has their own type of way of telling this. Even the fact that there was a bull, it's not continuous. There are some cases where we are told that it was actually a ship that had a bull painted on it that took Europe from Phoenicia to Crete. But generally speaking, this is the myth that we are talking about today. So who is Europe as a character? Basically, the fact that she is a princess is the only thing we know about her in most cases. It's a character that it's very often ignored and overlooked. She kind of feels more like a puppet than an actual character. It seems like everything in the story happens to her instead of she actually taking a role and doing something in her own story, right? She's very, very passive. If she's described in any way, which usually isn't, she's described as innocent and trusting. Those are the two things that we know about her, which is exactly the reason why she ends up in Crete having sexual relationship with Jupiter, right? And that's the reason why she ends up being taken away from her family. In most cases, too, we have the terms virgin and very young. And when we say very young, I mean very early teenager, or even a kid sometimes. Even Ovid said child's feet when describing her. And the only thing we usually know about her feelings towards what is happening to her is that she is scared. She is usually described as scared when she's traveling from Phoenicia to Crete on top of the bull, but that's basically the only thing we know about her and how she feels towards everything that's happening. So I wanted to make a couple of notes because I think, first off, language is extremely important. The way we decide to describe and name things specifically, it's extremely important. If you have noted, in the last slide, there was a painting, and the painting was called The Rape of Europe. Why? Because the Rape of Europe, it's the name used in the Anglo-Saxon tradition to refer to this myth, which in this case, we don't really have any questions about whether the sexual relationship was consented or not, because we already have the name rape on it. However, in Spanish, we call it el rapto de Europa, which means the kidnapping of Europe. In this case, we can play, and storytellers play with consent, whether they were consented or not, because they have the right to do so because of the name. And in this case, I think it's extremely important because it's very difficult to talk about this myth in the Spanish tradition without talking about consent, especially if we're talking about female representation. If we see anything from Europe besides what I've just told you, which is a very passive character that we have absolutely no idea about, usually consent is discussed as well. So that's something that we are going to see now. So first off, let's talk about Ovid, because he was the main influence. He talked about this myth in 5 different works, but we're going to be centered in the Metamorphosis, because that's the story that basically led the whole entire Spanish tradition in this myth. His version, it's actually very short. It's probably like a page long, no longer than that. We have very few details about this. We are told that Europe is scared when crossing to Creta, but other than that, it's basically what I just told you. There's no talk about how she feels about this, other than obviously scared, and she's basically a puppet that is used by Jupiter, and we have no idea about whether she did everything consensually or not. Now, let's move to the Spanish tradition. First off, we have Enrique de Villena, who wrote about the myth in the 15th century. And in this case, it's very important to talk about the context of why this was written, because it's key to understand what Enrique de Villena wanted to say about this myth, or how he interpreted it. So, Enrique de Villena had a friend called Juan Fernández de Valera, who lost his entire family to the plague. I'm talking wife, kids, parents, friends. He lost basically everyone. So Enrique de Villena decided to write Tratado de la Consolación to kind of uplift his spirits and tell him that there are worse things than having dead relatives, and uses Europe as an example of something worse than having a dead daughter. So he starts the myth by saying some women were corrupted by charms, which already gives us the key of knowing what Enrique de Villena feels about this. For him, the sexual relationships are going to be consented, because she was corrupted. She was very innocent, and that's what got her to do all these things, but at the end of the day, she decided to have sex, or at least that's what Enrique de Villena says, right? And basically what he wants to say to Juan de Valera is, it's way better to have a daughter that dies so young than having her go and have sex before marriage and dishonor you and your whole entire family, right? It's obviously way better to have a dead daughter, we all know that. But yeah, basically Jupiter conquers Europe with his charm, and Europe has an active role in this case, and she does consent to go to Creta. This is one of those very rare cases in which we don't have the bold transformation. It's actually a ship that she gets into consensually and goes to Crete with Jupiter. And during that time to Crete, it's when she falls for Jupiter, right? And he says, in this case, Agenor, Europe's father, didn't lose just one of his child to this story. He lost 2. Why? Because then Cadmo, his son and Europe's brother, was sent to Crete to search for Europe, and he never came back. So in this case, he lost 2 of his children when they were young adults, right? So Enrique Villena says it would have been way better to have them dead at a very young age than go through all of this. So in this case, Europe, it's just a property of her father. That's what Enrique de Villena is trying to say. Since she's your property, if she is dishonored, if she's taken advantage of, if she ends up falling for a man because of her innocence, you are the one who is going to be damned after this. Now, Fray Luis de León wrote about this in 1631. He doesn't take Ovid as an inspiration, he actually takes Homero, which is going to be a very different approach already. Homero wrote about it way more. And in this case, we see Europe's voice, because she's going to talk, she's going to have a monologue about how she feels. This monologue takes place after the sexual relationships happen. And she's described as trusting, like we've seen before. This is something that it's constant. It's going to happen in a lot of cases for the myth. And we see Europe's voice after the sexual relationships takes place, and the first thing she says is, "Oh, Father." So, like we've seen before, what we have here is a Europe that knows that dishonor is brought to the family and to the father more than it is to her. It doesn't matter that she was the one raped. What matters is what is going to happen if the father actually finds out about this. And she even says, "How dare I breathe after what I have done?" First off, she feels like she has an active role, whether she decided to have the sexual relationships or she felt like she led Jupiter on or something. She does feel like she has the blame for what has happened, right? And then she goes on to say, "Vile Europe, your father tightens the knot around your neck. What are you waiting for?" Because this is what the monologue is about. First off, she explains that if she ever sees the bull again, she will try to kill him, which already gives us a much more active character from Europe. She's somewhat violent. We can see what she feels about everything that has happened. She's angry, she's sad, and she thinks that if her father found out about what just happened, he would want her to be dead too. And she goes on about tying a knot around her neck or throwing herself to the sea to get drowned. But yeah, basically what she wants is to be dead before telling his father what she has done. And in here we have another female character, because at the end of this monologue, Venus appears with a disarmed Cupid. I think it's very important to note that Cupid was disarmed, because I think it's a very clear way to say there is absolutely no love here. Cupid doesn't have to throw anything, doesn't have to hurt anyone, because there is no love. And basically, Venus doesn't take any pity on Europe. We have absolutely no sorority here, because what she says is that Europe should be happy that Jupiter chose her, first off, because he is a god. She should be very happy that a god decided to have sex with her, right? Whether that was raping or not, she should be happy that she was chosen by a god. And also because a third of the world were named after her. At the end, our continent is named after Europe as a way of saying thank you from Jupiter. Now we have Antonio Gual, which is a very, very special case for the myth. It was published in 1639, but it actually doesn't tell or doesn't try to tell the story of Europe. This text is called El Cadmo. So what he's trying to speak about is about Cadmo, Europe's brother, and in the way he tells the story of Europe to justify why Cadmo was in Crete at the time. What we see here is a very different approach to both Europe and Jupiter. First off, we have a very strong Europe, and then we have a very patient Jupiter. Why? Because in this story we're told that when Jupiter took Europe to Crete, he asked her, "Do you want to have sexual relationships with me?" And she said, "No, I do not." So in this case, she does have a choice. But then what Jupiter does is leave her in Crete alone for 3 whole years. And during these 3 years, he comes back every single year and asks again, "Do you want to have sex with me?" And she says, "No." And one year, Jupiter says, "I could have taken you forcefully, but I didn't. And you should be grateful that I didn't, because I'm going to keep waiting until you say yes. But just note that until you say yes, you're going to be left alone here." So is it really a choice if she sees that as the only escape out of Crete and the only way to go back to his family? I don't know. At the end, she says yes. And then Jupiter says that she can be forgiven for her ever-changing opinion since she is a woman and it's what is expected from her. Europe is used as a stereotype of all women, right? She says no at first. She's been saying no for 3 years, but at the end, she will say yes. And this is the message that this story is trying to give away. If a woman says no, it doesn't matter, because she's going to change her opinion eventually. You just have to keep asking, and she will say yes at some point. So they end up having sex, and after the relationship happened, Jupiter sees Cadmo coming, And what he does is send Europe on top of a cloud to somewhere else where Camno can find her. When we say this, Europe, it's described as extremely sad, and she doesn't even speak. So I think this gives away what she actually feels like about the sexual relationships. She consented to those sexual relationships, but at the end, did she have a choice? Did she actually wanted to do it? Was she charmed by Jupiter, or was she just forced to have sex with him, to consent in a way to him? Well, after this, the conclusions that we can draw from all of this is that, first off, Europe sees her pain through the men in her life. The cases that we've seen, if she ever talks about what has happened to her and how she feels about it, she talks more about the men in her life than her. She's way more concerned about what this means for her father than what this means for her. She doesn't care about being alone with Greta. She doesn't care about being raped as long as her father doesn't find out, because that would bring dishonor to him. So Europe is treated just as a property for both her father, Agenor or Felix, depending on the storyteller, but also for Jupiter. And actually, I think she's more of a vehicle than she's a character. She's more of an action. I think more of her like when Bruce Wayne loses his parents to the Joker, and that's what makes him become Batman. This is kind of the same thing. Europe existing is what makes Jupiter take bad actions, take bad decisions, and why he ends up raping her. So she's more of an action than she is a character. She's used as a vehicle for something to happen later. She doesn't have a choice, I think, at the end of the day, because even when she does, like we've seen with Antonio Gual, she's given a choice, but at the end of the day, she's forced to have sex. Whether she wanted or not, she had to if she wanted to escape Crete. And even with that, she wasn't taken back to her family. So Jupiter, it's supposed to be patient, but at the end of the day, he was going to have sex with her, no matter how. Whether that was forcefully or with the consent of Europe, he was going to do it anyway. And finally, I think her story is used as a warning. First, for women to not be so trusting and innocent and not get on top of the ball in this case, but probably as a warning to not go with just anyone that you have just met. But what this thesis has taught me is that when this warning is made clear, it's more towards men than it is for women. Usually when the storyteller explains this warning, what he says is that majesty can't become in touch with lust, because lust makes you do horrible things. And a true gentleman could not be taken away, could not be swept away by lust. He can be controlled by lust. And that's the final warning in this story. Whether you fall for someone, whether you find someone attractive, you cannot ever let that take away your gentleness, right? And that's it. Thank you so much for being here. And if anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you so much.
Seems to be somehow seems to be a common figure in the European culture and legends, right? And myths. Because, for instance, in Poland, we also have this figure of a shoemaker. He was not a culture at all. He did not write anything, but he was clever enough to kill the dragon. The dragon that was, terrifying the village of Krakow in the Middle Ages, and everybody, had tried to kill the dragon and to marry the princess, obviously. But the shoemaker was the only one who managed to do it, and he obviously married the princess and became a king, the king of Poland
Yeah,
in the Middle Ages.
Maybe knowing about shoes it makes you powerful, you know.
Yeah.
I actually have a question for my colleague here, because you mentioned that it's called the rape of Europe or the rapto de Europa. I believe you won't have an answer for that, but maybe you will be interested about it. Maybe rapto and rape just come from the same word, and it.
Yep.
Yeah.
It
Also,
does.
you know.
Yep.
It does. Is it?
And actually, the fact that we call it el rapto de Europa in Spanish has a lot to do with the fact that Romans used to use kidnapping as a way to marry the person they were kidnapping. Sometimes when parents couldn't pay for the wedding, the man would kidnap the woman,
So to
his girlfriend. So they would have to get married. And some other times it was more pushed onto the woman. So he could kidnap the girl that he liked and rape her, and then she would be forced to marry this man to not bring dishonor into the family. So yeah, I'm not quite sure, but I'm pretty sure that it comes from that specific moment. And both traditions used two very different approaches to that word.
Yeah, because it really sounds like a euphemism. Like, yeah, he was raptured. No,
Yeah.
he was raped.
Actually, the first time I encountered this myth was in el Museo de Bellas Artes in Bilbao, because they have a beautiful painting. If you're interested, it's beautiful. But the thing is that I saw El Rapto de Europa, and then I saw the Rape of Europe, and I had never heard about the myth, so I just thought that it was a mistranslation, and that someone made a mistake. And that's when I learned that it's just different traditions. So
Makes sense. Thank you. Take mine.
I think in Latin, rapio means to take with violence, violently taking something. So if you take someone violently and it happens to be a woman, I think that the word euphemism, I don't think applies really. Therefore, when you have the Sabines being kidnapped by the Romans, that is a myth that is actually, I mean, we don't know, but probably it is.
yes.
Well, they had to make more people for their country.
Yes, but what I'm trying to say is that this idea of the kidnapping as a means to marry someone when the legal procedure is not available for some reason, that is also mythified in that idea of the Romans having to go and get those women forcefully. I have a question for you as well. In Gual, the last version is by Gual.
Antonio Gual. Yes.
Do you think he actually means it as a warning? Because this is probably a 21st century vision or interpretation or reading of what you just summarized. But it is very obvious, I would say, to me, that she can't. I mean, she can just languish and perish in this island, so she can choose death or rape. And so what kind of a choice is that, really? Do you think it is meant as a warning? First of all, perhaps clarification. Does he say, the author, I mean, when he is constructing the dialogue or the monologue, this is the idea that women are, that we change our minds, that we, because we are going to be so voluble as to change our minds eventually, so it means that we really don't, our yeses or nos don't really matter. So that's one thing. And then the other, it is constructed, how can it be read as is there a way in which it can be read as her having an actual choice? I don't see it. But
No,
probably it's my bias that I don't see it.
I don't see it either. I think it's important to note the time that it was written on, where consent wasn't as discussed as it is today. For us, it's completely obvious that she did not have a choice. But I think at the time, there are so many other cases where it's talked about the ever-changing nature of women and how they want you to pursue them and things like that. So I do think that in the time it was meant to be read as she did have a choice, especially when we talk about dishonor, because like we've said in other cases, it would be more desirable for the woman to die than to be raped. So at the end, I think it's supposed to be described as she did have a choice. And then the other thing you said was about the warning, about if it's used as the warning. I don't think this case used it specifically, but, well, no, it does use something take from Ovid, something that says, majesty can be mixed with lust. That's something that Ovid says, and it's repeated over and over again in this myth. But when I said that it's used as a warning, I meant basically mythology. I do think that most of the times it's used as a warning or as something that you have to learn from. But I meant it more in some other cases. It is very obvious. This myth appears in a guide to be a gentleman as well, and it's used as a warning for men to never do this type of violent thing and never be swiped away by lust.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for Igone. Was your name?
Igone, yes.
Thank you. Okay, maybe this is a bit of an ambitious question, a long shot, but one thing I was thinking about during your presentation was, so earlier this morning we were talking about the value of myth as something that sheds light on reality and guides sometimes our perception of the world, right? And I was curious about, well, the actual word Europe being used for the continent as such, whether in these authors that you have been talking about, especially in the early modern times, whether you find any application of the original Greek myth or any connection that is made between all of the value that you have been able to draw on from this myth to make any comments on the identity of Europe as a continent, as an entity, because sometimes, or often we see these myths being used to actually explain why such and such thing has these properties, right? So that would be my question.
Yeah, it's a curious question because a lot of times this is supposed to be the myth that explains why our continent is called Europe. But funnily enough, a lot of times there is no talk about it in the myth for some reason. We have the case where Venus says a third of the world is going to take your name, but in a lot of other cases, there is no explanation about it. It's supposed to be Jupiter trying to say sorry for what he does, because in a lot of cases, moving on in the story, because usually the myths are inserted in a more, in a way longer tale, right, of whether it's Jupiter or a specific time in mythology. Usually what ends up happening is that Jupiter feels bad for what he does because he knows that he shouldn't have done it. And as a way of saying thank you, he decides to call the continent Europe. And in another case, I think it was Mosco de Siracusa, a very classic author, talked about a woman being disputed by two continents, Europe and Asia. So, yeah, I don't know if I answered the question, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you.